The market square of Thornfield had never been so silent, not when the great frost of '42 claimed the church bell tower, nor when Lady Carmichael's funeral procession passed through with its 20 black horses. But as Miss Eleanor Winfield stood amidst the scattered remains of her flower basket, the very air seemed to congeal with unspoken judgment. The violets, symbols of her modest enterprise, lay crushed beneath boots that had hastily stepped back, creating a perimeter of shame around her. "No decent establishment will purchase from you now, Miss Winfield," came Mrs. Harcourt's voice, shrill and victorious. She clutched her gloves tighter, as though Eleanor's disgrace might soil the pristine white leather. "News travels faster than carriages in Thornfield." The whispers surged like a tide. They carried fragments that assembled into the scandal that had blossomed overnight. How Eleanor Winfield had been discovered in the east garden of Blackmore Abbey, in the arms of its master. How her lips had been pressed to his. How she had dared to desire a duke. The morning edition of the Thornfield Herald lay open on the greengrocer's counter, its bold headline a pronouncement of her sin. "Duke of Blackmore entrapped by local flower sellers' schemes." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she knelt, gathering broken stems with as much dignity as she could muster. The cut on her palm from yesterday's thorns had reopened, staining the petals crimson, a private mark of pain amidst the public disgrace. "I sold only flowers, Mrs. Harcourt," Eleanor said softly, not raising her eyes. "Nothing more." "And offered other favours to his grace, no doubt," sneered the butcher's wife, to murmurs of agreement. Eleanor paused in her gathering, her shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. Within the hollow of her shame bloomed a small, defiant light. For she alone knew the truth of that moment in the garden, how the Duke had spoken her name like a prayer, how his fingers had trembled more than hers when he touched her cheek, how the kiss had been gentle, unexpected, transformative. A shadow fell across the cobblestones before her. Polished boots of the finest calfskin stopped at the edge of her scattered violets. A gloved hand extended downward, not to assist, but offering a crisp white handkerchief embroidered with an unfamiliar crest. "For your hand, miss," came a voice she didn't recognize. "The blood will stain your dress." Eleanor looked up to find a gentleman she had never seen before. His dark attire spoke of wealth, his expression of compassion without pity. Behind him, his carriage waited, understated yet unmistakably that of quality. The crowd parted, momentarily distracted from their condemnation. "I require no assistance, sir," she replied, though she accepted the handkerchief with quiet gratitude. "Perhaps not," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But I believe we share an acquaintance who would be distressed to see you injured." Her eyes widened. Something in his tone, in the careful way he positioned himself between her and the crowd's scrutiny, suggested knowledge beyond the gossip that consumed Thornfield. "Your flowers will find a market elsewhere, Miss Winfield," he said, louder now. "Not all gardens are poisoned by rumour." He turned, nodding to his driver, and the crowd hastily stepped back as the carriage door opened. Before departing, he looked at Eleanor once more. "The Abbey's solicitor may call upon you tomorrow, a matter regarding the eastern property line, I believe. It would be prudent to receive him." Eleanor watched the carriage disappear around the corner, the mysterious gentleman's words echoing in her mind. The eastern property line, where her small cottage stood, where the garden wall of Blackmore Abbey ended, where she had encountered the Duke for the first time 3 weeks ago, when he had commented on the exceptional quality of her violets. That evening, as Eleanor closed her cottage door against the world's judgment, a letter waited on her small wooden table. She had not heard it arrive. The seal was of dark blue wax, unmarked by any crest or initial. With trembling fingers, she broke it open. The message contained but a single line in a hand both elegant and restrained. "Truth, like certain flowers, requires the darkness before it can bloom." The morning light filtered grudgingly through the lace curtains of Eleanor's cottage, illuminating the letter that had occupied her thoughts through a night of restless contemplation. The unmarked blue seal lay beside it, broken yet somehow still significant in its mystery. 3 sharp knocks at her door announced the arrival she had been both anticipating and dreading since the Market Square incident. "Mr. Holloway, solicitor to the Duke of Blackmore," announced the severe-looking gentleman on her threshold. His expression betrayed nothing of judgment nor sympathy as he removed his hat. "Might I have a moment of your time, Miss Winfield?" Eleanor's throat constricted. She smoothed her simple morning dress, the best she owned that wasn't reserved for Sundays, and gestured him inside with all the composure she could gather. "I have brought tea," she said softly, her domestic ritual a shield against vulnerability. The leaves were her most precious, saved for occasions that never seemed to materialize. "Most kind, but unnecessary," replied Mr. Holloway, setting his leather portfolio upon her small table. "I shall be direct. as propriety demands in such delicate circumstances. The solicitor's fingers, stained with decades of ink, withdrew several documents from his case. He arranged them with meticulous precision, his eyes occasionally darting to the broken blue seal still resting beside Eleanor's empty teacup. "The Duke has instructed me to present you with an offer regarding your cottage and the adjacent land," he began, his voice devoid of inflection. "It seems the property line has been incorrectly marked for some 30 years. Your eastern garden wall properly belongs to Blackmore Abbey." Eleanor's hands stilled upon the teapot. "I have the deed, sir, passed down from my father." "Indeed," interrupted the solicitor, "a deed which His Grace wishes to honor, despite its technical inaccuracy. He proposes to purchase your cottage and land at twice its market value, allowing you to relocate to more advantageous surroundings." The implication hung in the air between them. Relocation. Distance from Thornfield and its whispers. Escape from disgrace through financial compensation, a transaction that might appear generous to outsiders, but would confirm every suspicion of impropriety. "I see," Eleanor whispered, setting down the teapot with careful deliberation. "His Grace wishes to remove the source of his embarrassment." Something flickered across Mr. Holloway's face, surprise perhaps at her perception. "I merely convey the legal particulars, Miss Winfield. The Duke's motivations are not mine to interpret." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant song of a thrush in the garden where her violets grew, where the Duke had first paused, captivated by their scent, where, weeks later, a moment of unguarded emotion had destroyed her standing in the community. "There is an alternative proposition," the solicitor finally continued, withdrawing a sealed envelope from an inner pocket. Unlike the blue seal from the previous night, this bore the official crest of the Duke of Blackmore, a falcon above crossed swords. His Grace requested this be delivered personally, should you express any hesitation regarding the primary offer. The envelope felt impossibly heavy in Eleanor's hands. She broke the seal carefully, unfolding parchment of a quality she had never before touched. The same elegant handwriting from the mysterious blue-sealed note greeted her. "Miss Winfield, the Eastern Gardens require a knowledgeable caretaker. The position includes residence in the gardener's cottage within the Abbey grounds, and a modest but respectable stipend. Your expertise with violets would be particularly valued. Should this arrangement prove acceptable, Mr. Holloway will provide the necessary documents." Blackmore. Eleanor's breath caught. Not exile, but proximity. Not compensation for silence, but an offer of honest work. Yet the implications remained troubling. A position within his household would fuel even more scandalous assumptions. "The Duke," she began carefully, "must be aware that such an arrangement would only validate the rumors." "His Grace," replied the solicitor with unexpected warmth, "is more concerned with what is right than what is rumored." A sudden memory surfaced in Eleanor's mind, the Duke's voice in the garden, low and earnest. "Society's constraints are but paper cages, Miss Winfield. They appear formidable until one discovers they can be torn." The solicitor cleared his throat, returning to his professional demeanor. "There is one final document requiring your attention." His fingers extracted a slip of heavy parchment, presenting it with marked formality. "His Grace will attend the Midsummer Assembly at Thornfield Hall next Friday evening. This is your invitation, should you wish to provide your response in person." Eleanor stared at the invitation, the engraved script, the official seal, her name written in that same elegant hand that had penned both mysterious notes. To appear at Thornfield Hall, before the very society that had shunned her, would require courage she wasn't certain she possessed. "The Duke is aware that attending might prove challenging for you," added Mr. Holloway, gathering his papers. "He asked me to convey that sometimes, Miss Winfield, the most effective response to injustice is simply to stand in one's truth." As the solicitor departed, tipping his hat with unexpected respect, Eleanor remained motionless beside her table. The invitation lay before her like a challenge, or perhaps a promise. The morning light had strengthened, illuminating the ducal seal in shades of crimson and gold. Outside her window a carriage passed, not the solicitor's modest conveyance, but a grander vehicle bearing a crest she recognized instantly. The curtains were drawn, obscuring its occupant, but as it slowed near her cottage, a gloved hand momentarily appeared at the window. In it was a single violet, held briefly to the glass before the carriage continued its journey toward Blackmore Abbey. The chapel of St. Agnes stood like a sentinel of stone against the morning mist, its weathered facade having witnessed generations of Thornfield's prayers and gossip in equal measure. Eleanor hesitated at its threshold, the weight of Sabbath propriety heavy upon her shoulders. 3 days had passed since Mr. Holloway's visit, yet the invitation to the Midsummer Assembly remained unanswered, hidden beneath her mother's Bible in the drawer beside her bed. "Courage, Miss Winfield," came a soft voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Pembroke, the elderly widow who had taught her letters as a child. The woman's gloved hand rested briefly upon Eleanor's arm. "The Lord's house welcomes all his children, regardless of what wagging tongues might claim." Eleanor's throat tightened with gratitude for this small kindness. Together they entered the chapel, the sudden hush that fell upon the congregation, pronouncing judgment more clearly than any sermon could. Pews that had once accommodated Eleanor without comment now seemed to contract, leaving no space for her presence. "Make room, if you please," Mrs. Pembroke announced with quiet authority to the Millers, who had strategically arranged their Sunday best to occupy an entire row. Reluctantly they shifted, casting sidelong glances at Eleanor as though her disgrace might be contagious. Reverend Caldwell's sermon that morning centered upon the prodigal son, a choice Eleanor could not help but interpret as deliberate. His eyes seemed to find her with uncomfortable frequency as he expounded upon redemption and forgiveness. Yet there was something in his emphasis that struck her as peculiar, almost as though he addressed not her situation, but another's entirely. "Even those of highest station must bow before the Almighty's judgment," he intoned, his gaze sweeping the congregation. "Privilege of birth provides no exemption from moral accountability." A murmur rippled through the chapel, and Eleanor realized with a start that she was not the only object of scrutiny that morning. Discreetly, she turned her head, following the direction of furtive glances. In the Duke's traditional pew, occupied only on Christmas and Easter for as long as Eleanor could remember, sat the gentleman from the market square. His attire, though impeccable, was subdued, his expression contemplative rather than haughty. Beside him was an empty space, conspicuous in its vacancy. On his other side sat a severe-looking older woman whose imperious profile suggested family resemblance. "The Dowager Duchess," whispered Mrs. Pembroke, following Eleanor's gaze. "Her return from Bath quite suddenly, they say. The Duke himself was expected, but—" Her words trailed off as the chapel door opened once more, admitting a latecomer who drew every eye. Eleanor's heart stuttered as the Duke of Blackmore himself entered, removing his hat with unhurried grace. His appearance was striking not for its grandeur, but for its restraint. No ornate waistcoat or ostentatious jewelry, merely the immaculate tailoring and quiet confidence that true nobility required no embellishment. For a moment that seemed suspended in time, his eyes met Eleanor's across the chapel. There was no hint of embarrassment or regret in his gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them like a current. Then, with a slight inclination of his head that might have been meant for her alone, he joined his family in their ancestral pew. The remainder of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers that Eleanor's lips formed automatically, her mind occupied with the Duke's unexpected presence and what it might portend. As the congregation rose for the final blessing, Reverend Caldwell made an announcement that caused Eleanor's fingers to tighten around her prayer book. "The Duke of Blackmore has graciously offered his patronage for the restoration of our east window," he proclaimed. "Furthermore, His Grace has proposed the establishment of a modest garden upon the chapel grounds to be planted with violets," here a pointed pause, "which he suggests might serve as a symbol of renewal and humility for our parish." The significance of the gesture was lost on no one. Whispers erupted immediately, gazes darting between Eleanor and the Duke with renewed speculation. When the service concluded, Eleanor found herself unable to depart with the customary haste her situation had recently demanded. Instead, she remained seated, allowing the congregation to file past. Mrs. Pembroke squeezed her hand once before joining the exodus, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts, or so she believed, until a shadow fell across her pew. "Miss Winfield." The Duke's voice was precisely as she remembered from their encounters in the garden, measured, warm, carrying authority without arrogance. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Eleanor rose, conscious of the few lingering parishioners who made no attempt to disguise their interest in this exchange. "Your Grace," she acknowledged, her curtsy modest but not subservient. "I believe you've met my brother, Lord James," continued the Duke, gesturing to the gentleman from the market, who now approached with the Dowager Duchess on his arm. "Indeed," Eleanor replied, recognition dawning. "Your kindness at the market was most appreciated, my lord." Lord James smiled. "I merely acted as my brother would have had he been present." The Dowager Duchess, however, offered no such pleasantries. Her assessment of Eleanor was swift and penetrating, her disapproval evident in the tightening of her mouth. "So this is the flower girl," she pronounced, the words falling like stones between them. "Mother," the Duke interjected, his tone respectful but firm. "Miss Winfield is a skilled horticulturist whose family has resided in Thornfield for 3 generations. Her father served as parish clerk until his passing." Something shifted in the Dowager's expression, not warmth precisely, but a reluctant reassessment. "The Winfields of Briar Cottage, Thomas Winfield's daughter." "Yes, Your Grace," Eleanor confirmed, surprised by the recognition. "He kept immaculate records," the Dowager conceded, as though this constituted high praise. "Come, James, the carriage awaits, and I find the air in here suddenly insufficient." As Lord James escorted his mother from the chapel, the Duke remained standing closer to Eleanor than propriety strictly permitted. "You received my invitation," he said quietly. "It was not a question." "I did, Your Grace." "And have you reached a decision?" Eleanor's fingers smoothed the fabric of her modest Sunday dress. "To attend would invite further speculation, Your Grace. Your gesture with the violet garden is already causing considerable talk." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Speculation will persist regardless of our actions, Miss Winfield. The only question is whether we shall give them truths or fictions to discuss." From his pocket, he withdrew a small, leather-bound volume. "I thought you might enjoy this. It contains illustrations of rare flowering plants from the continent. My late father collected such works." Their fingers brushed as she accepted the book, a momentary contact that sent a tremor through her composure. As she opened the cover, a pressed violet fell into her palm, not fresh but preserved with care, its delicate form intact despite the passage of time. "This was the first," he said, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. "From the day we met at the garden wall, I kept it." Before she could respond, the chapel door opened once more. The Reverend Caldwell appeared, his expression transparently curious. "Excuse me, Your Grace, but your mother is most insistent that—" "Of course, Reverend, I was just leaving." The Duke bowed slightly to Eleanor. "Until the assembly, Miss Winfield." He departed with measured steps, leaving Eleanor clutching the book, the preserved violet a secret treasure in her palm. As she finally left the chapel, she noticed a small inscription on the book's flyleaf, written in the now familiar hand, "Some flowers bloom most beautifully after the frost." Outside, the Duke's carriage was just pulling away. The Dowager's disapproving profile was visible through the window, but beside the vehicle stood Lord James, watching Eleanor with undisguised interest. "My brother," he said as she approached, "is not known for impulsive actions, Miss Winfield. Whatever passed between you must have been exceptional indeed." Eleanor clutched the book tighter. "Nothing inappropriate occurred, my lord." "A kiss is hardly nothing, Miss Winfield," he replied, his tone neither accusatory nor teasing but matter-of-fact, "particularly for a man who has refused every suitable match presented to him for the past 5 years. Before she could formulate a response, Lord James bowed and moved toward a second, smaller carriage. "I look forward to seeing you at the assembly," he called over his shoulder. "Do come. It promises to be quite the memorable occasion." As both carriages disappeared down the lane, Eleanor stood motionless, the book pressed against her heart, the preserved violet a secret between its pages. The chapel bell tolled once, marking the hour, the sound reverberating through the stone and into the ground beneath her feet. From the churchyard, the newly proposed site for the violet garden, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, the town still watching, still judging. But for the first time since the scandal erupted, Eleanor found herself standing straighter, her gaze lifting from the ground to the horizon beyond. The arrival of Mrs. Harrington's dressmaking carriage outside Eleanor's cottage drew more attention than the parish fire of '39. Neighbors who had studiously avoided her path now lingered at garden gates, straining to glimpse this unprecedented development. Mrs. Harrington herself, Thornfield's premier modiste and arbiter of acceptable society, had never before been seen on this humble lane. "Miss Winfield," she announced, sweeping into the cottage with a rustle of expensive fabric. "I come on behalf of a client who wishes to remain anonymous." Eleanor set aside her gardening shears, acutely aware of the soil beneath her fingernails. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake, Mrs. Harrington. I have no appointments with—" "No mistake, my dear. I am commissioned to provide you with appropriate attire for the midsummer assembly." The dressmaker withdrew a folded paper from her reticule. "I have the measurements from your last fitting 3 years ago for your father's funeral gown. You appear unchanged, though perhaps we should verify." "Mrs. Harrington," Eleanor protested, heat rising to her cheeks, "I cannot accept such an arrangement. The impropriety is less than you might imagine." interrupted the dressmaker, unfolding a length of measuring tape with brisk efficiency. The benefactor is not who you presume, but rather a lady of impeccable standing who believes the current difficulties have been most unjustly attributed. A knock at the door prevented further explanation. Eleanor opened it to find a boy from the post office, cap clutched respectfully in hand. "Telegram for Miss Winfield," he announced, extending the envelope with undisguised curiosity. Eleanor accepted it, pressing a small coin into his palm that she could ill afford to spare. The telegram's contents proved brief, but devastating. Thornfield Herald, tomorrow stop full account of Blackmore scandal. Stop sources claim financial arrangement. Stop advise. Immediate departure. Stop a friend. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she refolded the paper. A financial arrangement, the very implication she had feared most. The purchase of her silence, her dignity, her very personhood, reduced to a transaction. Worse still, the suggestion that she had accepted such terms. "Miss Winfield," Mrs. Harrington's voice seemed to come from a great distance. "You've gone quite pale." "I cannot attend the assembly," Eleanor whispered. "It would be unwise." The dressmaker's eyes narrowed, her practical nature asserting itself. "A young lady, I have dressed 3 generations of Thornfield society. There is little about scandal I do not comprehend." She plucked the telegram from Eleanor's unresisting fingers, scanning its contents with pursed lips. "As I suspected, a rather transparent attempt to prevent your appearance. But if tomorrow's paper will contain whatever fabrications its editor deems profitable, regardless of your actions today." Mrs. Harrington returned to her measuring with renewed determination. "Now stand straight. The gown I envision will require precise proportions." As the dressmaker worked, Eleanor's mind raced through implications and possibilities. Who had sent the telegram? Friend or foe? Who had commissioned the gown? The Duke, despite Mrs. Harrington's denial, or some other player in this increasingly complex game? "There," announced the dressmaker at last, noting the final measurement. "The gown will be delivered Thursday evening. Pale blue silk with silver embroidery. Subtle, elegant, entirely appropriate for a young woman of good family, facing unfortunate circumstances with dignity." After Mrs. Harrington's departure, Eleanor stood in her garden, the telegram crushed in her hand, her thoughts a tempest of uncertainty. The violet bed before her, source of her modest livelihood and catalyst for her current predicament, seemed to mock her vulnerability. She did not hear the approach of hoofbeats until they stopped at her gate. Looking up, she found herself facing the Dowager Duchess of Blackmore, mounted on a magnificent grey mare, unaccompanied save for a groom who maintained a discreet distance. "Miss Winfield." The Dowager's voice matched her posture, erect, commanding, brooking no defiance. "A moment of your time." Eleanor curtsied, acutely conscious of her gardening apron and soil-stained hands. "Your Grace." The Dowager made no move to dismount, instead surveying the cottage and garden with penetrating assessment. "My son appears to have developed an interest in your horticultural endeavors." "His Grace has been most kind regarding my modest skills," Eleanor replied carefully. "Kind," repeated the Dowager, the word dangling between them like a suspect article, "an attribute frequently mistaken for something more personal." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she raised her eyes to meet the Dowager's gaze directly. "I have never presumed upon His Grace's kindness, Your Grace." Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not softening precisely, but recalculation. The Duke's father maintained an extensive botanical collection. It was his one true passion, apart from his duties. My son inherited this peculiarity. She reached into a saddlebag, withdrawing a small package wrapped in oilcloth. "These papers were among my late husband's effects. They may be of interest to you, particularly regarding certain propagation methods for Viola odorata." Stunned, Eleanor accepted the package. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "Understanding is not required, Miss Winfield, merely discretion." The Dowager gathered her reins. "I shall expect you at the assembly. Wear the blue silk. It will complement your complexion, while maintaining appropriate modesty." With that cryptic pronouncement, she turned her mount and departed, leaving Eleanor clutching the mysterious package, the crumpled telegram still in her other hand. That evening, as lamplight cast long shadows across her small table, Eleanor carefully unwrapped the Dowager's gift. Inside were indeed detailed notes on violet cultivation, written in a strong masculine hand that bore no resemblance to the Duke's elegant script. But beneath them lay something else, a legal document, its seal broken, its implications profound. It was a marriage contract, dated 26 years earlier, between Thomas Winfield, her father, and Margaret Ellington, a name Eleanor had never encountered. Annotations in the margins, in her father's familiar handwriting, referenced correspondence that had evidently continued for years. The final notation, dated shortly before his death, read simply, "The child must never know. Her happiness depends upon silence." Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. What child, what silence had preserved what happiness, and why had the dowager chosen now to reveal this document? A soft knock at her door startled her from these bewildering questions. Opening it, she found no visitor, only a small package on the threshold wrapped in familiar blue paper, sealed with unmarked blue wax. Inside lay a brooch of silver filigree, fashioned in the shape of a violet. With it, a note in the Duke's hand, "For tomorrow's Herald, stand in your truth and I shall stand beside you." Dawn brought with it the dreaded newspaper. Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the Thornfield Herald on her doorstep, bracing for the promised scandal. The headline froze her breath in her lungs. "Duke of Blackmoor announces botanical exhibition and patronage. Thornfield violet cultivation to receive formal recognition." Beneath it, smaller but no less significant, Dowager Duchess returns from Bath confirms late Duke's correspondence with local scholar. Of scandal, of kisses, of impropriety, not a single word. The Midsummer Assembly at Thornfield Hall loomed like a fortress on the horizon, its windows ablaze with candlelight that spilled across the formal gardens. Eleanor sat rigid in the hired carriage, the blue silk gown from Mrs. Harrington rustling softly with each breath. The silver violet brooch caught the fading daylight, a small talisman against the ordeal ahead. "We have arrived, miss," announced the driver, his tone suggesting curiosity about his unusual passenger. Eleanor gathered her courage along with her modest evening bag. The path to the entrance stretched before her like a gauntlet, lined with arriving guests whose conversation faltered as they recognized the infamous flower seller in their midst. "Miss Winfield." Lord James appeared at her side as though conjured by her distress, offering his arm with an encouraging smile. "Allow me to escort you. My mother awaits inside." The gesture, publicly linking her to the Duke's family, sent a ripple through the assembled guests. Eleanor accepted his arm, conscious of every whisper, every sidelong glance. "Courage," murmured Lord James as they approached the entrance. "Remember that not all watching eyes belong to enemies." The grand ballroom of Thornfield Hall had been transformed for the occasion. Garlands of summer blossoms adorned every cornice, their fragrance mingling with beeswax candles and ladies' perfumes. In the center, a space had been cleared for dancing, though the orchestra had not yet begun to play. "Miss Winfield, how unexpected," remarked Lady Carmichael, her tone suggesting nothing could be less surprising than this calculated appearance. "One wonders who provided your invitation." "I did, Lady Carmichael," came the Dowager Duchess's voice, imperious and uncompromising. She approached with regal bearing, her walking cane striking the polished floor with deliberate emphasis. Miss Winfield's presence was specifically requested. The pronouncement delivered in the Dowager's incontestable manner effectively silenced Lady Carmichael, whose retreat was hastened by the arrival of Reverend Caldwell. "Miss Winfield," he greeted, bowing slightly. "The chapel garden plans have been approved by the parish council. Your expertise will be most valuable in their implementation." Eleanor, still reeling from the Dowager's unexpected support, could only nod her acknowledgement. Before further conversation could develop, the orchestra struck its first chord, signaling the commencement of dancing. "I believe this is where I claim my dance," said Lord James, guiding Eleanor toward the floor. "Unless you'd prefer to wait for my brother's arrival." "His Grace is attending?" Eleanor asked, her voice betraying more emotion than she intended. Lord James's smile held knowing amusement. "He would scarcely miss his own assembly, though pressing business at the Abbey has delayed him. Until then, I hope you'll find me an acceptable substitute." As they took their positions for the quadrille, Eleanor became acutely aware of the room's scrutiny. Ladies whispered behind fans, gentlemen assessed with narrowed eyes. Yet the music carried her forward, the familiar patterns of the dance providing structure amidst uncertainty. "You dance remarkably well, Miss Winfield," observed Lord James, as they briefly came together in the figure. "My mother believed in comprehensive education," Eleanor replied, executing a turn with practiced grace. "And your father?" he inquired, his tone casual, yet somehow pointed. "What did Thomas Winfield believe in?" The question, unexpected and strangely specific, nearly caused Eleanor to miss a step. "Precision and truth, my lord. He tolerated no falsehood, however comfortable." "Admirable qualities." Lord James replied, his gaze shifting to something or someone beyond her shoulder. Qualities, it seems, the next generation has inherited. The dance concluded, and as Lord James escorted her from the floor, Eleanor felt the atmosphere in the ballroom subtly change. Conversation dimmed, heads turned toward the entrance. Without seeing, she knew who had arrived. The Duke of Blackmore stood in the doorway, his evening attire impeccable, his presence commanding immediate attention. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Eleanor before continuing its survey with deliberate casualness. "Fashionably late as ever, Edward," remarked the Dowager, approaching her son with evident satisfaction. "Miss Winfield has been adequately entertained in your absence." "So I observed," replied the Duke, his voice carrying to where Eleanor stood. "James always had a talent for stepping into roles I temporarily vacate." Something in his tone suggested layers of meaning beyond the immediate context. Lord James merely smiled, inclining his head in acknowledgement. "If you'll excuse me," he murmured to Eleanor, "I believe Mrs. Pembroke wishes to speak with you." Indeed, Eleanor's former teacher beckoned from near the refreshment table, her kind face a welcome sight amidst the swirl of uncertain allegiances. "You've caused quite the stir, my dear," Mrs. Pembroke said, offering a glass of lemonade, though perhaps that was precisely the intention. "Not mine, I assure you," Eleanor replied, accepting the cool drink gratefully. "No, perhaps not yours alone," agreed the older woman, her gaze drifting meaningfully toward the Duke, now engaged in conversation with several local dignitaries. "But intentions, once set in motion, often develop their own momentum." Mrs. Pembroke's gnarled fingers gently adjusted the silver-violet brooch on Eleanor's bodice, a lovely piece, rather similar to one I recall from years ago, though that belonged to... She stopped abruptly as a shadow fell across them. The Duke himself stood before them, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Pembroke, might I borrow Miss Winfield for a moment? There are matters regarding the chapel garden that require her input." "Of course, Your Grace," replied the elderly woman, her eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "Gardens, after all, require constant attention." The Duke offered his arm, which Eleanor accepted with heightened awareness of every watching eye in the ballroom. He led her not to the dance floor as she had half expected, but toward a set of French doors opening onto a lamplit terrace. "You received my token," he observed, nodding toward the brooch. "Yes, Your Grace, it was most generous." "It was necessary," he corrected, his voice low, "as was your attendance tonight. Certain narratives can only be countered by visible truths." They stepped onto the terrace, the evening air cool against Eleanor's flushed cheeks. From this vantage, the assembled company remained visible through the windows, yet they stood momentarily apart from its direct scrutiny. "The newspaper," Eleanor began. "It wasn't what I expected." "Expectations can be managed, Miss Winfield, when one understands the proper mechanisms." His smile held a hint of satisfied strategy. The Herald's editor proved remarkably receptive to patronage for his son's education. The revelation should have shocked her, yet Eleanor found herself admiring the calculated precision with which the Duke had evidently orchestrated recent events. "Your mother," she ventured carefully, "gave me documents about my father." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recalibration. Did she indeed? That was unexpected. They referenced a Margaret Ellington, and a child whose happiness depended upon silence. Eleanor watched his face closely. "Do you know what they meant, Your Grace?" The Duke's gaze turned toward the gardens beyond the terrace, his profile suddenly reminiscent of the Dowager's assessment at the chapel. "Margaret Ellington was my father's first cousin. She died in childbirth 25 years ago." The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken yet increasingly apparent. "The child," Eleanor whispered. Before he could respond, the French doors opened once more. Lord James appeared, his expression unusually grave. "Edward, you're needed inside immediately." His eyes flicked to Eleanor. "Both of you, in fact. It seems Lady Carmichael has made certain pronouncements that require addressing." The Duke's jaw tightened. "What sort of pronouncements?" "The sort that question Miss Winfield's parentage and suggest a motive for your interest in her welfare." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The documents, the Dowager's cryptic statements, Mrs. Pembroke's unfinished observation about the brooch, all clicking into place with terrible clarity. "Come," said the Duke, offering his arm once more, his voice gentle but resolute. "Truth, as your father believed, is preferable to comfortable falsehood, even when it arrives at inconvenient moments." As they re-entered the ballroom, the orchestra fell silent. All eyes turned toward them, some curious, some scandalized, some gleaming with the particular satisfaction of those who believe their worst suspicions confirmed. Lady Carmichael stood at the center of the room, her expression a mixture of triumph and disdain. In her hand was a letter held aloft like evidence in a courtroom. "Your Grace," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent ballroom. "Perhaps you would care to explain why your father maintained such regular correspondence with Thomas Winfield regarding the welfare of his illegitimate niece." The seal on the letter was blue, the same unmarked blue wax that had sealed the Duke's first mysterious note to Eleanor. The silence that followed Lady Carmichael's accusation seemed to crystallize the very air of the ballroom. Eleanor stood immobile, the Duke's arm beneath her hand, the only anchor in a world suddenly rendered unfamiliar. The letter, with its blue seal, trembled slightly in Lady Carmichael's triumphant grasp. "I would be pleased to explain," replied the Duke, his voice steady and carrying, "if you would be so kind as to inform the Assembly how such private correspondence came into your possession, Lady Carmichael." The counterstroke, delivered with perfect composure, caused Lady Carmichael's expression to falter momentarily. The assembled guests, sensing the delicate shift in power, leaned forward with collective anticipation. "The letter was discovered among parish records," she recovered, though her fingers tightened visibly around the parchment. "As patroness of St. Agnes, I naturally review such documents periodically." "How diligent," observed the Dowager Duchess, advancing into the circle that had formed around the confrontation. Her walking cane struck the floor with deliberate emphasis. "Though I recall no such authority being granted to review sealed correspondence kept in the parish chest." Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Indeed, such documents are meant to remain private, Lady Carmichael. Their removal without proper—" "The contents concern us all," interrupted Lady Carmichael, sensing her position weakening. "If Miss Winfield is in fact the late Duke's natural daughter, her recent associations with the current Duke take on a most disturbing character." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Eleanor felt the weight of every speculative gaze, the whispers like physical touches against her skin. The implications were clear and horrifying. "You suggest," the Duke said, his tone dangerously controlled, "that I have formed an attachment to my own half-sister." The blunt articulation of the accusation caused gasps among the listeners. Lady Carmichael's smile turned predatory. "The evidence appears to support such a conclusion, regrettable though it may be." Eleanor's knees threatened to buckle beneath her. The blue silk of her gown suddenly felt confining, the air too thin to sustain consciousness. Yet even as darkness edged her vision, the Duke's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, steadying her with gentle pressure. "The evidence," came Lord James's voice, clear and cutting, "supports no such conclusion, as Lady Carmichael well knows." He stepped forward, withdrawing from his coat an envelope identical to that in Lady Carmichael's possession, sealed with the same unmarked blue wax. "This letter from the same correspondence makes the matter entirely clear. My father, upon the death of his cousin, Margaret Ellington, arranged for her infant daughter's care. The child was placed with Thomas Winfield and his wife, who had recently lost their own daughter to fever." Eleanor's breath caught. "I was adopted?" "With great love and devotion," confirmed the Dowager, her customary severity softened by unexpected gentleness. "Your parents, but Thomas and Grace Winfield were your parents in every meaningful sense, raised you as their own at the request of my husband, who felt an obligation to his cousin's orphaned child." The revelation washed over Eleanor in waves of disorientation, the foundation of her identity, shaken yet not destroyed. She had been wanted, chosen, beloved by the parents she remembered, yet the sense of herself as their natural daughter, their continuation, that certainty was gone forever. "The brooch," she whispered, fingers rising to touch the silver violet at her bodice. "It belonged to her, to Margaret Ellington." "Yes," confirmed the Duke, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "My father kept it for you, intending it as a gift upon your coming of age. When he passed, the responsibility fell to me, though circumstances delayed its delivery." Lady Carmichael, sensing the narrative slipping from her control, rallied for a final assault. "Even if Miss Winfield is not your sister, Your Grace, she remains your cousin. The impropriety of a romantic attachment between relations—" "Cousins once removed," corrected Lord James, his tone suggesting the distinction was significant. "A degree of relationship that has never prevented matrimonial alliances, even among the highest families." The word matrimonial sent a fresh wave of whispers through the assembly. Eleanor felt the Duke's posture shift beside her, tension gathering in his frame. "The nature of my relationship with Miss Winfield," he stated, voice ringing with authority that silenced even the whispers, is not subject to speculation or debate in this forum. What I will state categorically is that Lady Carmichael's insinuations are both false and malicious. He turned to Reverend Caldwell. I trust the parish records will be more securely maintained henceforth, with access limited to appropriate parties. Absolutely, Your Grace. The Reverend hastily agreed. The vestry has already approved installation of a proper lock for the parish chest. Excellent. The Duke surveyed the assembly, his gaze both challenge and dismissal. I believe the orchestra was in the midst of a selection before this interruption. It was a command, not a suggestion. The musicians hastily resumed their playing, and the crowd, recognizing the matter concluded, at least publicly, began to disperse into conversational clusters. Eleanor stood immobile, still processing revelations that had transformed her understanding of herself within mere moments. The Duke guided her gently toward a less crowded corner of the ballroom, where a small alcove offered relative privacy. I had intended, he said quietly, to share this information with you in more appropriate circumstances. Lady Carmichael's intervention was unfortunate. You knew, Eleanor said, the words more statement than accusation. From the beginning. Not from the beginning, he corrected. I knew of my father's arrangement with Thomas Winfield, but I had never met you until that day at the garden wall. Your name, Winfield, connected to the violets you cultivated with such expertise, made me curious. When I saw you, he paused, seeming to search for adequate words. There was something in your countenance that reminded me of the portrait of Margaret Ellington in my father's study. I began to suspect and then to investigate. The blue seal was hers. She used it for personal correspondence, unmarked by family crests or obligation. Eleanor's mind struggled to reconcile this new knowledge with her experiences of recent weeks. The kiss, she whispered, heat rising to her cheeks at the memory. You knew then that I knew nothing with certainty, he interrupted, his voice low but intense. I knew only that I had found myself thinking of you with increasing frequency, that your conversation and your quiet dignity affected me in ways I had not anticipated. The kiss was unplanned, improper perhaps, given the uncertainty of your connection to my family, but never, Eleanor, never motivated by anything but genuine regard. It was the first time he had used her given name. The intimacy of it, coupled with the raw honesty in his expression, threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. What happens now? She asked, her voice hardly more than a whisper. Before he could respond, Mrs. Pembroke approached, her lined face grave. Miss Winfield, I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a matter requiring your immediate attention. She extended a small silver salver upon which rested a folded note. Eleanor accepted it with trembling fingers, breaking yet another seal of unmarked blue wax. The message inside was brief and devastating. Briar Cottage ablaze, fire brigade summoned. Come at once. The Duke read the message over her shoulder, his reaction immediate and decisive. My carriage is waiting. James will escort you while I make arrangements for assistance. As Eleanor hurried toward the entrance, supported by Lord James's steady arm, she heard the Duke issuing rapid commands to his steward. Behind them, the assembly continued, the scandal already transforming into the next evolution of gossip. Outside, the night sky glowed orange in the direction of Eleanor's home. As Lord James handed her into the Duke's carriage, he pressed something into her palm, a small key of tarnished silver. The East Wing gardener's cottage has been prepared, he said quietly. Whatever the outcome tonight, you will not be without shelter. As the carriage lurched forward, Eleanor clutched the key like a talisman. Through the window, she caught a final glimpse of Thornfield Hall, its windows bright with candles and secrets. At the main entrance stood the Duke, his tall figure unmistakable, watching the carriage's departure with an expression she could not decipher at such distance. The blue silk of her gown, the gown that had marked her brief, tumultuous entrance into a society that would never truly accept her, shimmered in the lantern light as the carriage carried her toward the burning remnants of the only home she had ever known. The road to Briar Cottage seemed interminable, each turn revealing the fire's glow burning ever brighter against the night sky. Eleanor sat rigid, the silver key to the gardener's cottage digging into her palm, its physical pain a welcome distraction from the anguish unfolding in her heart. Lord James maintained a respectful silence beside her, understanding that platitudes would offer no comfort in the face of such devastation. When the carriage finally rounded the last bend, Eleanor's breath caught painfully in her throat. Briar Cottage, the home where she had been born, raised and loved by parents she now knew had chosen her, stood partially consumed by flames. The fire brigade worked with frantic efficiency, their efforts concentrated on preventing the blaze from spreading to neighboring dwellings, rather than salvaging what little remained of the structure itself. "Wait," Lord James began, but Eleanor was already descending from the carriage, heedless of her fine silk gown, as she rushed toward the inferno that had been her sanctuary. "Miss Winfield!" The fire brigade captain intercepted her. "You mustn't approach closer. The roof beams could collapse at any moment." "My father's books," Eleanor protested, struggling against his restraining arm. "My mother's keepsakes. Nothing could be saved from the eastern rooms," the captain said gently. "The fire began there in your garden shed. By the time it was discovered, the back of the cottage was already engulfed." Eleanor's knees weakened as the implication registered. The garden shed, where she kept her seed stocks, her horticultural journals, her modest supplies for the violet cultivation that had been both her livelihood and her connection to a history she hadn't known, was hers. It wasn't an accident. The words came unbidden to her lips, certainty blooming with terrible clarity. "Lady Carmichael makes no habit of soiling her hands with lamp oil and matches," came the Duke's voice from behind her. He had arrived unnoticed, his evening attire incongruous against the chaos of the fire scene. "But those who serve her interests might be less fastidious." The brigade captain shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, we cannot say with certainty how the fire began." "Perhaps not officially," the Duke replied, his tone suggesting the distinction was meaningful. "Nevertheless, I would advise examining the garden gate for evidence of forced entry, and perhaps questioning those who were conspicuously absent from the assembly this evening." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening. "I've arranged for a physician to attend you at Blackmore Abbey. The shock of such an event—" "I require no physician," Eleanor interrupted, drawing herself upright, despite the trembling in her limbs. "Only shelter until I can determine my next course." Lord James stepped forward. "The gardener's cottage awaits as promised." The Duke nodded. "James will escort you there now. I shall remain to oversee the investigation and salvage operations." "Investigation?" Eleanor echoed, the words seeming inadequate against the backdrop of her smouldering home. "Arson is a criminal matter," the Duke replied, his voice hardening to steel, "particularly when motivated by malice against someone under my protection." The phrase hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Eleanor, still reeling from multiple revelations, could not fully process. Protection, family obligation, or something more personal, more profound. "Your Grace," she began uncertainly, "I cannot impose upon—" "It is not imposition, Miss Winfield," he interrupted gently. "It is restoration. The East Gardens have awaited their rightful caretaker for too long." From the shadows beyond the fire brigade's lanterns emerged the Dowager Duchess, her carriage visible further down the lane. She surveyed the destruction with grim assessment, her walking cane striking the earth with unusual force. "So, Lady Carmichael has made her response," she observed, approaching Eleanor with unexpected directness. "I misjudged her capacity for direct action, an error I shall not repeat." "Mother," cautioned the Duke, "this is neither the time nor the place for truth?" The Dowager's eyebrow arched imperiously. "I disagree. Truth becomes more essential as circumstances grow more dire." She turned to Eleanor, her gaze penetrating. "You will come to the Abbey tonight. The gardener's cottage, while adequately prepared, is too isolated for safety until those responsible are identified." It was not a request, but a command, delivered with absolute certainty of compliance. Eleanor, depleted by the successive shocks of the evening, found herself without strength to refuse. "My possessions," she began weakly, "will be secured and inventoried at first light," the Duke assured her. "Whatever can be salvaged will be. For tonight, however, your safety takes precedence." As if to punctuate his words, a terrible groaning emanated from the cottage, followed by the thunderous collapse of the remaining roof section. Sparks erupted skyward like malevolent stars, briefly illuminating the faces of neighbors who had gathered to witness Eleanor Winfield's final humiliation. Yet among their expressions, Eleanor noted something unexpected, not schadenfreude or righteous satisfaction, but something that might have been concern. Even Mrs. Harcourt, who had been most vocal in the Market Square condemnation, watched with apparent dismay as the cottage walls began to crumble. "Miss Winfield," Reverend Caldwell approached, his expression grave but kind. "The parish hall is at your disposal, should you prefer accommodations less complicated by recent revelations." Before Eleanor could respond, the Dowager rapped her cane sharply against the ground. "While the parish's offer is noted, Miss Winfield's place is with her family, a truth that should have been acknowledged years ago." The public declaration, delivered in the Dowager's incontestable manner before the assembled witnesses, effectively silenced any further debate. Eleanor felt the weight of the pronouncement settle upon her shoulders, not as burden, but as unexpected shelter. Lord James offered his arm. "The Duke's carriage awaits, cousin." The familial address, spoken deliberately for all to hear, completed what the dowager had begun. Whatever Eleanor's future held, she would face it not as the disgraced flower seller of Thornfield, but as kin to the Blackmore lineage, a transformation as sudden and complete as the destruction of her former home. As she allowed herself to be guided toward the carriage, Eleanor cast one final glance at Briar Cottage. Through the smoke and flame, she glimpsed her bedroom window, the small square of glass where, for 25 years, she had watched the seasons change across Thornfield Village, where her father, Thomas Winfield, parish clerk and devoted parent, had taught her to read by lamplight, where her mother had braided her hair each morning, singing softly the hymns that now seemed to echo from the burning timbers themselves. "It isn't the walls that make a home," came the Duke's voice close beside her ear. "It's the love they witnessed. That at least the fire cannot claim." Eleanor turned to find him watching her with an expression of such tender understanding that her carefully maintained composure finally shattered. A single tear traced its path down her cheek, catching the firelight like a diamond. The Duke reached out, not to brush it away, for such intimate gesture would be improper even in these extraordinary circumstances, but to offer his handkerchief. As Eleanor accepted it, their fingers brushed momentarily, and in that fleeting contact she felt something pass between them. Not mere compassion, nor family obligation, but a current, more elemental, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended the night's calamities. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we begin anew." Blackmore Abbey loomed against the dawn sky, its ancient stone facade softened by morning mist that clung to the formal gardens. Eleanor stood at the window of the blue chamber, a guest room far grander than any accommodation she had previously experienced, watching as the rising sun gradually illuminated the east gardens, visible beyond the terrace. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, sleep having proven elusive despite the luxurious bed with its damask hangings and feather mattress. She had exchanged the ruined silk gown for a simple morning dress provided by the dowager's lady's maid, modest, but of excellent quality, fitting with surprising accuracy. Like everything at Blackmore Abbey, it seemed part of a design set in motion long before Eleanor had become aware of its existence. A gentle knock announced the arrival of breakfast, carried by a maid whose curtsy contained exactly the right measure of respect, neither the excessive deference that would acknowledge scandal, nor the casual familiarity that might suggest impropriety. "His Grace requests your presence in the library at 10 o'clock, miss, if you feel sufficiently recovered," the maid informed her, setting down the tray. "The Dowager Duchess has already departed for Thornfield to oversee certain arrangements on your behalf." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the delicate porcelain teacup. "What arrangements?" "I couldn't say, miss." The maid's expression remained carefully neutral, though Mr. Holloway arrived at first light with several documents requiring urgent attention. After the maid's departure, Eleanor forced herself to eat, knowing her strength would be required for whatever revelations the day might bring. The simple act of buttering toast in these grand surroundings struck her as surreal. Yesterday morning, she had performed the same ritual at her humble kitchen table, unaware that by nightfall, her entire existence would be transformed. At precisely 10 o'clock, she made her way to the library, guided by a footman whose professional demeanor betrayed nothing of curiosity about this unusual guest. The Abbey's corridors were lined with portraits, stern-faced ancestors, whose features occasionally suggested faint resemblance to the current Duke. Eleanor wondered if Margaret Ellington's likeness hung somewhere among them, and whether she might recognize in that unknown cousin's face some echo of her own. The library door stood open, revealing a magnificent chamber whose walls disappeared behind floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. At the center, a massive oak table bore maps and documents, arranged with methodical precision. The Duke stood examining these papers, his expression betraying fatigue that suggested he too had found little rest. "Miss Winfield." He looked up at her entrance, his formal address contrasting with the intimate concern in his eyes. "I trust you were provided with everything necessary for your comfort." "Yes, Your Grace, your staff has been most attentive." Eleanor remained near the doorway, uncertain of the proper protocol. Despite the previous night's revelations of familial connection, she felt keenly the vast gulf between their positions. "Please sit." He gestured to a chair opposite his own at the table. "There are matters we must discuss before the day advances further." Eleanor complied, her gaze drawn to the documents spread before them. Among them she recognized the blue-sealed letter that Lady Carmichael had brandished at the assembly, now returned to its rightful custodian. "The fire brigade captain has confirmed our suspicions," the Duke began without preamble. "The blaze was deliberately set. Footprints were discovered leading from the rear garden to the lane where a horse had been tethered. The constable is pursuing inquiries." "To what end?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Even if the perpetrator is identified, my home cannot be restored." "No," he agreed, his expression softening. "But justice can still be served, and appropriate compensation provided." He indicated a document bearing the official seal of the magistrate's court. "I have filed a formal complaint on your behalf as head of your family." The phrase sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor's chest, despite the circumstances. Head of her family. After a lifetime as Thomas Winfield's daughter, she now found herself claimed by a different lineage, one whose power and influence were evident in every aspect of her surroundings. "Your Grace, while I appreciate your intervention, I cannot allow you to—" "Edward?" he interrupted gently. "When we are private, at least, I would prefer you use my name. The formality seems unnecessary, given our connection." "Our connection," Eleanor repeated carefully. "As distant cousins." Something flickered across his features, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. "Yes, though that hardly encompasses the complexity of our situation." He rose, moving to a side table where a leather portfolio lay waiting. "I've had Holloway prepare these papers for your review. They establish a trust in your name, providing an annual income sufficient for independent living, should that be your preference. Alternatively, the gardener's cottage at the East Gardens remains available, with a position as curator of botanical collections." Eleanor stared at the portfolio, emotions warring within her breast. The offer was more than generous. It was life-altering. Yet some stubborn core of pride rebelled against what could be interpreted as charitable compensation for her misfortunes. Why? The question emerged more bluntly than she intended. "Why such generosity to a distant relation you scarcely know?" The Duke's expression remained inscrutable as he returned to his seat. "Do I scarcely know you, Eleanor? I know you tend violets with extraordinary skill. I know you face adversity with quiet dignity rather than bitter complaint. I know you value truth above comfort and honor above advantage." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the blue seal before him. "I know that when I first saw you at the garden wall, something within me recognized something within you, a recognition that preceded any knowledge of our familial connection. Does that not constitute knowing?" The raw honesty in his voice rendered Eleanor momentarily speechless. When she finally found words, they emerged soft but clear. "You speak as though of matters beyond family obligation." "Because they are beyond obligation," he confirmed, meeting her gaze directly. "Though perhaps we should address the more immediate concerns before turning to personal considerations." From a drawer in the library table, he withdrew a small wooden box, its surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl in a pattern of violets. "This belonged to Margaret Ellington, your mother by birth. My father preserved it for you, though circumstances prevented its proper transmission. With reverent care, he placed it before Eleanor. Its contents may answer questions I cannot." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she lifted the box's delicate lid. Inside lay several items: a miniature portrait of a young woman with features that echoed her own, a pressed flower, not a violet, but a sprig of forget-me-not, a simple gold ring, and several folded letters, their blue seals intact. "I have not read them," the Duke said quietly. "They were meant for you alone." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she gently touched the miniature portrait. Here was the face she had never known, the woman whose life had ended as Eleanor's began. The profound grief of this realization, that she had gained a mother only to lose her simultaneously, washed over her with unexpected force. She loved poetry, the Duke offered gently, and played the pianoforte with remarkable skill. My father said her laugh could illuminate the darkest corner of any room. Eleanor looked up, grateful for these small gifts of knowledge. "And my father, my birth father?" The Duke's expression grew somber. "A young lieutenant in the cavalry. He died at Sevastopol before learning of Margaret's condition. They had planned to marry upon his return." Another piece of the puzzle slipped into place. Why the late Duke had arranged for her care, why the secret had been so carefully maintained. Not shame, but protection of a love story interrupted by tragedy. "The Winfields," Eleanor whispered. "Did they know who I was?" "They knew everything," he confirmed. "They were selected precisely because Thomas Winfield had been my father's most trusted correspondent on botanical matters. Their own daughter had recently passed away. The confluence of circumstances seemed providential." A knock at the library door interrupted this moment of revelation. Lord James entered, his expression unusually grave. "Edward, I apologize for the intrusion, but there's a situation requiring immediate attention. Lady Carmichael's son has arrived at the gatehouse, demanding to speak with you regarding his mother's arrest." Eleanor gasped. "Arrest? A temporary measure? the Duke explained, rising from his seat. The magistrate required her presence for questioning regarding certain correspondence found among her possessions, correspondence that appears to have been removed from your father's papers without authorization. But surely that doesn't warrant. The correspondence included certain financial documents, Lord James interjected, his tone suggesting deeper implications. Documents that may establish motive for last night's unfortunate events. The Duke's expression hardened. I'll speak with young Carmichael in the study. Perhaps you might show Miss Winfield the East Gardens in my absence. The violets there have been sadly neglected since Barton's retirement. Lord James nodded, offering his arm to Eleanor with courtly grace. It would be my pleasure. The morning light shows them to particular advantage, though their condition is indeed lamentable. As they departed the library, Eleanor cast one final glance at the box containing Margaret Ellington's treasures. The Duke had left it open upon the table, a tacit acknowledgement that she might return to explore its contents at her leisure. The gesture spoke of trust, of acceptance, of the beginning of a relationship not defined by obligation or circumstance, but by mutual choice. In the corridor, Lord James slowed their pace once they were beyond the Duke's hearing. My brother, he said quietly, has not shown such interest in another person since returning from the Crimea. Whatever connections of blood or circumstance exist between you, I suspect they are secondary to matters of the heart. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this direct acknowledgement of what had remained unspoken. Lord James, James, he corrected with a smile. We are family, after all, distant cousins at the very least. At the very least, Eleanor echoed, her thoughts turning to the Duke's carefully chosen words in the library. Matters beyond obligation, personal considerations. As they stepped onto the terrace overlooking the East Gardens, the morning sun burned away the last vestiges of mist, revealing beds of violets in various states of neglect, yet still stubbornly blooming, their modest purple blossoms turning toward the light with quiet determination. The eastern wall requires extensive repairs, Eleanor observed, kneeling beside a crumbling section of stonework where moisture had penetrated the mortar. Her fingers traced the damage with professional assessment, momentarily forgetting the fine morning dress she now wore instead of her customary gardening attire. The drainage channel has been blocked, causing water to pool against the foundation. James watched with undisguised amusement as she systematically examined the garden's ailments, making mental notes with the concentration of a physician diagnosing a patient. In the hour since they had entered the East Gardens, Eleanor had identified half a dozen critical issues requiring immediate attention and twice as many minor concerns that would benefit from proper care. You've transformed already, he remarked, offering his hand to assist her rise. Yesterday a flower seller facing scandal. Today a garden mistress issuing diagnoses with absolute authority. Eleanor accepted his help, brushing soil from her skirts with an apologetic smile. Old habits, I'm afraid. My father, Thomas Winfield, believed that gardens, like people, reveal their true character through their difficulties. A philosophy Edward would appreciate, James replied, guiding her toward a stone bench positioned to catch the morning sun. He applies similar principles to estate management. They sat in companionable silence, surveying the neglected expanse that had once been the pride of Blackmore Abbey. Despite its current condition, Eleanor could discern the original design's elegant simplicity, a series of concentric beds radiating from a central fountain, now dry and choked with leaves. Why did the late Duke not maintain this space? She asked finally. If he was so devoted to botanical pursuits, James's expression grew contemplative. After Margaret's death, he rarely entered these gardens. They had been her particular project. The violets were cultivated from specimens she had collected during their courtship. The similarities to your own interests are striking. Eleanor absorbed this new connection to her birth mother with quiet wonder. And the current Duke, does he share this botanical inclination? Edward's interests lie more in the practical applications of horticulture, James replied. Agricultural improvements, experimental cultivation techniques. The aesthetic aspects hold less appeal for him, or did until recently. His knowing smile caused heat to rise in Eleanor's cheeks. Before she could formulate a suitable response, a gardener's boy approached, cap clutched respectfully in hand. Begging your pardon, my lord, miss. His Grace requests Miss Winfield's presence in the study immediately. There's been a development regarding Lady Carmichael. James rose, offering Eleanor his arm once more. I suspected this might occur. Lady Carmichael is not one to accept defeat graciously, particularly when legal consequences loom. As they traversed the Abbey's corridors, Eleanor became increasingly conscious of the staff's deferential acknowledgement. Curtsies and bows offered with a respect that suggested her position had been firmly established overnight, no longer a guest of uncertain standing, but a recognized member of the family circle. The study door stood ajar, revealing the Duke engaged in intense conversation with Mr. Holloway. Both men looked up at Eleanor's entrance, their expressions suggesting the matter under discussion was of grave significance. "Miss Winfield," the Duke greeted her, his formal address at odds with the warmth in his eyes. "Thank you for coming. A situation has developed that requires your input." Mr. Holloway cleared his throat. "Lady Carmichael has proposed a resolution to the current unpleasantness, one that would avoid criminal proceedings while addressing the damage to your property." Eleanor's brow furrowed. "What sort of resolution?" The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She offers full financial compensation for the destruction of Briar Cottage and its contents, along with a public retraction of any defamatory statements, in exchange for our agreement not to pursue criminal charges regarding the fire." "You believe she was responsible?" Eleanor asked, startled by the directness of the implication. "We have evidence that her footman, acting on explicit instructions, removed certain documents from your father's papers and later set fire to the garden shed," the Duke confirmed. "The man is currently in custody and has provided a signed confession implicating his employer." Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, the magnitude of such calculated malice momentarily overwhelming her composure. "But why? What possible motivation?" "Land," Mr. Holloway interjected, his professional demeanor momentarily giving way to undisguised contempt. "The Carmichael estate borders the eastern portion of your property. Lady Carmichael has sought to acquire that parcel for years, as it contains the spring that feeds her ornamental lake. Thomas Winfield refused all offers," the Duke continued, his voice gentling as he noted Eleanor's distress. "After his passing, Lady Carmichael apparently believed you might prove more amenable to persuasion or coercion. When my interest in your welfare became evident, she grew concerned that the opportunity was slipping away. So she attempted to discredit me," Eleanor concluded, the pieces aligning with terrible clarity, "to isolate me socially, then destroy my home, leaving me vulnerable to financial pressure." "Precisely." The Duke's expression darkened. A strategy that might have succeeded had circumstances been different. James, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke from his position near the door. "Lady Carmichael's son awaits your decision in the morning room. He seems eager to resolve the matter without further scandal." Eleanor's thoughts whirled with conflicting emotions: anger at the calculated cruelty, grief for the home and possessions irretrievably lost, and beneath these, a strange relief that the source of her persecution had not been her relationship with the Duke after all. "What do you advise?" she asked, looking between the Duke and Mr. Holloway. The solicitor deferred to his employer with a slight inclination of his head. The Duke stepped closer to Eleanor, his voice lowering with unexpected intimacy despite their audience. "That depends entirely on what you wish for your future, Eleanor. If you intend to remain in Thornfield Village, continuing as before but in new accommodation, then accepting Lady Carmichael's offer might provide the smoothest path forward. The criminal proceedings would inevitably bring additional notoriety." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features. "If, however, you are considering other possibilities, then perhaps justice should take its natural course, regardless of social discomfort." The implication hung in the air between them. Other possibilities that might remove her permanently from Thornfield society and its judgments. Possibilities that might place her firmly within the sphere of Blackmore Abbey instead. "I need time to consider," Eleanor said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "This decision affects more than just myself." The Duke nodded, understanding immediately the broader implications she referenced. "Of course, perhaps you might wish to review the contents of Margaret Ellington's box more thoroughly before reaching any conclusion. There may be insights there that would inform your choice." He gestured toward a side table where the inlaid box awaited, transferred from the library during her garden inspection. The sight of it, this tangible connection to her birth mother, steadied Eleanor's resolve. "Yes," she agreed, "though I would prefer to do so privately." With a gesture that encompassed both James and Mr. Holloway, the Duke cleared the room, pausing at the threshold before his own departure. "Whatever you decide, Eleanor, know that your place at Blackmore Abbey remains secure, not from obligation, but from preference." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with Margaret Ellington's legacy and the weight of a decision that would determine not only her own future, but potentially the Duke's as well. With reverent care, she removed the letters from the box, their blue seal still intact after a quarter-century. The topmost envelope bore a simple inscription, "For my child, when they come of age." Eleanor broke the seal with trembling fingers, unfolding paper that crackled with age yet remained perfectly legible. "My dearest one," the letter began in a flowing, feminine hand, "if you are reading these words, then I have not had the privilege of watching you grow into the person you were meant to become. Know that you were conceived in love, and that your father, Lieutenant William Hayes of the 11th Hussars, would have cherished you had he lived to know of your existence." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she continued reading the letter's contents, a mother's hopes, dreams, and counsel for a child she would never know. The final paragraph, however, caused her breath to catch painfully in her throat. "Above all, my child, I wish for you the courage to follow your heart's true direction, even when convention or circumstance might dictate otherwise. My cousin Edward has promised to ensure your welfare, but it is my deepest hope that you will find not merely security, but the kind of love that transforms ordinary existence into something extraordinary. I found such love, however briefly, and count myself blessed for having known it at all." Eleanor carefully refolded the letter, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. Lady Carmichael's offer, practical though it might be, represented a continuation of the pattern that had defined her life in Thornfield: compromise, accommodation, the careful navigation of others' expectations and judgments. Margaret Ellington had wished for her daughter something more, the courage to pursue extraordinary possibilities rather than merely acceptable ones. Rising from her chair, Eleanor crossed to the study door with newfound determination. In the corridor outside, she found not a servant but the Duke himself, waiting with patient stillness that suggested he had not moved since leaving her to her private contemplation. "I've reached my decision," she said simply. He straightened, his expression carefully neutral despite the tension evident in his posture. "And what have you decided?" "That Lady Carmichael's offer, while practically advantageous, would represent a form of capitulation to the very forces that have sought to diminish me." Eleanor's voice strengthened as she continued, drawing conviction from the echo of her birth mother's written words. "I prefer justice to expediency, truth to comfortable falsehood." Something like admiration kindled in the Duke's gaze. "Even if the path proves difficult?" "Especially then," Eleanor replied. "Difficulty has been my constant companion these past weeks. I find I've grown rather accustomed to its presence." A smile, genuine and unguarded, transformed the Duke's austere features. "Then we shall inform young Carmichael of your decision together." As they walked side by side toward the morning room, their hands brushed momentarily, a fleeting contact that nevertheless sent awareness coursing through Eleanor's entire being. The Duke glanced down at her, his expression containing a question he had not yet voiced aloud. "There is one condition I would add to my decision," Eleanor said quietly, as they paused outside the morning room door. "Name it," he replied without hesitation. "That you call me Eleanor henceforth, without qualification or circumstance, as you did in the garden, before everything changed." His eyes held hers, something profound passing between them in that suspended moment. "Eleanor," he said softly, her name in his voice like a promise. "Then you must call me Edward." "Edward," she echoed, testing the intimacy of it upon her tongue. The door opened before them, revealing young Lord Carmichael's anxious countenance. Behind him, through the morning room windows, the East Gardens stretched toward the horizon, neglected yet resilient, waiting to bloom once more under caring hands. Together, they stepped forward to deliver their response. 6 months had transformed the East Gardens beyond recognition. Autumn's golden light illuminated beds of late-blooming violets, their modest purple blossoms nodding in the gentle breeze. The restored fountain at the garden's center played a soft melody of falling water, its basin cleared of debris and lined with gleaming new tiles. Along the once crumbling eastern wall, freshly pointed stonework supported espaliered fruit trees, their branches carefully trained to follow the geometric pattern established in the original design. Eleanor stood on the stone terrace, surveying her domain with quiet satisfaction. The gardener's cottage, renovated and expanded under her direction, had proven a perfect residence, its proximity to both the gardens and the abbey, allowing her to move easily between her professional responsibilities and her increasingly frequent social engagements. Lady Carmichael's trial had concluded 3 months earlier, resulting in a substantial fine and her temporary removal to a distant relative's estate in Northumberland. The scandal had occupied Thornfield society briefly, then faded as all such matters eventually do. replaced by newer gossip about the vicar's daughter and a visiting military officer. The Dowager Duchess approached along the terrace, her cane striking the stonework with its characteristic authority. Age and infirmity had done little to diminish her commanding presence, though Eleanor had discovered unexpected warmth beneath the formidable exterior. "The improvements exceed even my expectations," the Dowager remarked, surveying the gardens with critical assessment. "You've restored more than plants and stonework. You've recaptured the original vision." "I had excellent guidance," Eleanor replied, indicating the leather-bound volume of garden plans she had discovered among Thomas Winfield's salvaged papers. "My father kept meticulous records of the original design, including detailed notes from Margaret Ellington herself." The Dowager's expression softened at the mention of her late niece. Margaret would be gratified to see her gardens flourishing again, though perhaps even more pleased by certain personal developments. Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks at this direct reference to her evolving relationship with the Duke. In the months since the fire, their connection had deepened through daily interactions and shared interests, each carefully maintaining propriety while navigating the complex emotional territory between familial obligation and deeper attachment. "His Grace has been most supportive of the restoration efforts," Eleanor replied diplomatically. "His Grace," echoed the Dowager with uncharacteristic amusement, "has spent more time in these gardens these past 6 months than in the previous 10 years combined. I doubt his sudden horticultural enthusiasm stems solely from agricultural interest." Before Eleanor could formulate a suitable response, the garden gate opened to admit the subject of their discussion. The Duke approached with long, purposeful strides, his expression brightening visibly as he caught sight of Eleanor. "Mother, might I borrow our garden mistress for a private consultation? There's a matter regarding the western expansion that requires her expertise." The Dowager's eyebrow arched knowingly. "By all means, though I suggest remaining within sight of the terrace windows. Mrs. Pembroke joins us for tea, and her eyesight remains disconcertingly acute for a woman of her years." With that parting admonition, she made her way toward the Abbey, pausing only once to cast a meaningful glance back at her son and the woman who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. "There is no western expansion planned," Eleanor observed, as the Duke offered his arm to escort her along the garden path. "An unfortunate fabrication," he admitted without remorse, though perhaps prophetic rather than entirely false. "I've been considering extending the cultivated area beyond the current boundary." They walked in companionable silence, following the path that wound through beds of autumn plantings toward a small pavilion positioned to catch the day's last light. It had become their habit to meet here in the hour before sunset, ostensibly to discuss garden progress, but increasingly to share thoughts and confidences that had little to do with horticulture. "So you've received correspondence from London," the Duke said, as they seated themselves on the pavilion's stone bench. "The Royal Horticultural Society has expressed interest in your paper on violet hybridization." Eleanor smiled, remembering the hours spent documenting Thomas Winfield's experiments, continuing work that had apparently begun in collaboration with the late Duke himself. "My father would be pleased. He always believed his methods deserved wider recognition." "Both your fathers would be proud," the Duke corrected gently, the distinction acknowledging the dual heritage she had come to embrace. "As am I." His hand moved to cover hers where it rested on the bench between them, a gesture just within the boundaries of propriety, yet conveying emotions that transcended conventional limitations. In the months since the fire, such moments of connection had grown more frequent, each one a tacit acknowledgement of feelings neither had yet articulated fully. "Edward," Eleanor began, using the name that still felt intimate despite its increasing familiarity, "there is something I've been meaning to discuss." He turned toward her, his expression attentive. "I am at your disposal, as always." "The botanical exhibition opens in 3 weeks," she continued, focusing on the practical details to steady her nerves. "After its conclusion, my formal obligations to Blackmore Abbey will be fulfilled according to our original agreement." A shadow crossed his features. "Are you considering departure?" "Quite the opposite." Eleanor drew a deep breath, summoning courage that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. "I am considering a more permanent arrangement. If such would be welcome." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by an emotion too complex for simple definition. "Eleanor, are you proposing a continuation of your position as garden mistress?" "I am proposing," she replied with quiet dignity, "that we acknowledge what has grown between us these past months, something far more significant than horticultural collaboration." The Duke's expression transformed, caution giving way to carefully restrained hope. "You speak of matters beyond professional association." "I speak of matters of the heart," Eleanor confirmed, her voice steady despite the rapid fluttering beneath her ribs. Mine has become increasingly occupied with thoughts not entirely related to violet cultivation. A smile touched the corner of his mouth, the rare, unguarded expression she had come to treasure. I find myself similarly afflicted, though propriety has prevented me from expressing the full extent of my condition. Propriety, Eleanor echoed thoughtfully, which dictates that family connection, however distant, should preclude romantic attachment. A consideration that has haunted my thoughts, he admitted, yet one which, according to Mr. Holloway's exhaustive research, need not prevent what my heart most desires. Our connection is sufficiently removed to satisfy even the strictest interpretation of church law. He shifted on the stone bench, turning to face her more directly. But legality alone is insufficient reason to pursue what I have contemplated these many weeks. There must be reciprocity of sentiment. Eleanor's fingers curled around his, the garden gloves she habitually wore now absent, allowing the warmth of skin against skin. I believe I have just provided evidence of such reciprocity, Edward. The formality of their exchange, the careful circumlocution around emotions too profound for direct expression, dissolved as he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her palm with a reverence that spoke more eloquently than words. Then I must ask, he said softly, what you envision for our future. The gardener's cottage, while admirably suited to your current position, would prove somewhat limiting for the Duchess of Blackmore. The title hung in the air between them, not as presumption but as possibility. Eleanor's breath caught at its implications, at the transformation it represented not merely in status, but in the very foundation of her existence. I had considered, she replied carefully, that the east wing of the Abbey might be reopened. It overlooks the gardens quite advantageously. Indeed it does. His thumb traced gentle circles against her wrist, each movement a promise of intimacies yet to come. Though such arrangements typically follow certain formal declarations and ceremonies, Eleanor smiled, emboldened by the certainty she read in his gaze. I believe traditional procedure dictates that you should make the declaration, Edward. Despite my rather forward introduction of the subject, in a movement that startled her with its suddenness, he slipped from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. The position, formal, traditional, unmistakable in its intent, rendered Eleanor momentarily speechless. Eleanor Winfield, he began, his voice steady yet infused with emotion that transformed the familiar words into something uniquely their own. From the moment you corrected my misidentification of Viola odorata at the garden wall, you have cultivated within me feelings that have grown beyond any rational expectation. Would you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife? Tears blurred Eleanor's vision, not of sorrow or even overwhelming joy, but of recognition. Here, finally, was the truth that had been growing between them since that first encounter. Not obligation, not scandal, not even family connection, but the simple, extraordinary miracle of two souls recognizing themselves in each other. Yes, she whispered, the single syllable containing multitudes. With all my heart, yes. He rose, drawing her to her feet, and into an embrace that remained just within the boundaries of propriety. Should Mrs. Pembroke indeed be watching from the terrace, his forehead pressed against hers, the intimacy of the gesture more profound than any passionate declaration could have been. There will be talk, he murmured against her hair. Society has barely reconciled itself to your position as my distant relation and garden mistress. Society, Eleanor replied with newfound confidence, will adapt to this development as it has to all others, with initial resistance followed by convenient amnesia once the novelty fades. His laughter, warm against her temple, acknowledged the truth of her assessment. The Dowager will be insufferably pleased with herself. She has been maneuvering toward this outcome since the night of the assembly. A formidable ally, Eleanor agreed, though I suspect James bears some responsibility as well. His strategic appearances and disappearances have been suspiciously well-timed. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Lord James appeared at the garden gate, lifting his hand in greeting before tactfully retreating upon noticing their proximity. The brief interruption reminded them of the world beyond their private understanding, a world they would soon face together. Shall we share our news? The Duke asked, offering his arm once more. Eleanor nodded, though her hand lingered on the pavilion's stone column, a momentary hesitation that he immediately perceived. Second thoughts already? He inquired, his tone light though his eyes revealed genuine concern. Not about us, she assured him, only about the transition. From Eleanor Winfield, orphaned flower seller, to the Duchess of Blackmore. It seems a journey of impossible distance. Not impossible, he corrected gently, merely unexpected, like the rarest hybrid blooming where no cultivation was attempted. His reference to her beloved violets, to the work that had connected her to both her adoptive father and her birth mother, eased the momentary apprehension. Eleanor slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, allowing him to guide her back toward the abbey where their announcement awaited. As they walked, the setting sun cast their shadows long across the restored garden, two figures moving in perfect synchronicity, their paths now permanently intertwined. Behind them, in the pavilion where their future had taken shape, a late violet bloomed unseasonably among the autumn plantings, its modest purple blossom turning toward the fading light with quiet determination. Inside the abbey, the dowager awaited with Mrs. Pembroke, their conversation suspended as Eleanor and the Duke entered the drawing room together. One glance at their expressions told the entire story, rendering formal announcement almost redundant. "Well," pronounced the dowager, her satisfaction barely concealed beneath a veneer of practical assessment, "it appears Blackmore Abbey will finally have a proper mistress again. Mrs. Pembroke, I believe we shall require additional tea. This occasion deserves appropriate celebration." As the elderly teacher departed on this errand, a smile of genuine pleasure illuminating her lined face, the dowager approached Eleanor with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Margaret would have approved," she said quietly, her hand briefly touching Eleanor's cheek in a gesture that conveyed decades of unspoken regret and newfound hope, of both the gardens and the gardener. Edward's fingers tightened around Eleanor's, the pressure conveying shared understanding of the significance behind the dowager's words. The circle had somehow completed itself, loss transformed to discovery, scandal to celebration, isolation to belonging. Outside, twilight descended upon the east gardens, casting violet shadows across paths restored through diligence and vision. Within the abbey, lamps were lit against the gathering darkness, their golden glow a promise of warmth and welcome for all who entered. Eleanor Winfield, soon to be Duchess of Blackmore, stood at the threshold between these worlds, finally understanding that she belonged equally to both. No longer the scorned flower seller, nor merely the discovered relation, but a woman who had found her rightful place through courage, dignity, and the transformative power of words spoken in truth. True dignity comes not from social position, but from the courage to stand in one's truth, even when scorned. The most profound transformations arise not from external validation, but from being recognized for who you truly are. Love, when authentic, sees beyond circumstance to the essential character within. Did this Victorian romance capture your heart? Subscribe now to receive more enchanting stories of love, dignity, and redemption set in richly detailed historical worlds. Comment below with your favorite moment from Kissed by the Duke She Shouldn't Have Desired, and share your thoughts on Eleanor and Edward's journey from scandal to celebration.